Hi people, it's me, Anja. My pronouns are she and her, and welcome back to my channel for part 2 of my favorite Sapphic historical fiction books. Historical fiction is truly one of my favorite genres, and I'm always trying to diversify it by reading queer historical fiction or POC historical fiction, etc., etc. With that said, even when I do read queer historical fiction, so often I don't really enjoy the books I read, and obviously I want to recommend books that I really enjoyed, aka books that I've rated 4 stars or higher. So anyway, with that said, that's why it's been a year or more than a year since I did part 1 to this. But anyway, without any further ado, I hope this video helps diversify your bookshelf. And second of all, the first book on this list is called Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken. This story is a YA historical fiction following a young queer main character who is discovering her sexuality, her identity, as well as discovering the swing youth movement, which is something that I knew next to nothing about prior to reading this book. I'm not sure if I read this book or The Most Dazzling Girl in Berlin first, since that book also dives into the swing youth movement too. But anyway, this book was so good and it was so educational. I loved the characters and the romance and the plot and the setting and everything about it. There was just something that's so relatable about living under an oppressive, corrupt government and having your identity, weaponized against you. Does that make any sense? Anyway, I thought this book was so good, and with that said, I would definitely highly recommend it. The next book on this list is called Renegade Girls. This story is a YA Sapphic historical fiction graphic novel that follows a young queer main character who basically works as America's first stunt girl, and it's set in the 1880s, and what a stunt girl was back then, to my understanding, is that she's an undercover reporter, which I think is such an interesting job because, I love stories that center on spies or detectives or reporters or journalists or anything that has to do with, uncovering the truth or, uncovering conspiracies or secrets or whatever. Anyway, I thought this book was so good. First of all, the illustrations were so pretty and so vivid. Second of all, the Sapphic romance was so cute and so well paced. Third of all, the characters themselves are so well developed and so distinct. This book is so good and it deserves all of its hype and so much more because I really enjoyed every single element of the entire story. So anyway, with that said, I would definitely highly recommend it. The next book on this list is called Everything Glittered. This story is a YA Sapphic historical fiction following a young queer main character in 1927 as her headmistress of her all-girls boarding school is killed and she and her best friends try to uncover the mystery. However, I will say this book is far more romance-driven and character-driven than plot-driven, so the mystery is kind of like the secondary plot, if that makes any sense. But anyway, this book was so good and it was so fantastic. I loved the plot and the characters and the mystery and everything. It's so good. I think this book is so underrated, even though I said recently that I think that word doesn't really have much meaning whenever I say it, because I don't actually know what books are objectively popular lately. So whenever I say a book is underrated, it doesn't really mean anything if I don't know what books are the opposite of underrated lately. But anyway, this book was so good and just really awesome. I love the plot and the setting and everything. So anyway, with that said, I would definitely highly recommend it. The next book on this list is called Gwen and Alt Are Not in Love. This story is a YA historical fiction set during the medieval era, and it's following a nobleman and a betrothed princess who discover that they're both gay, essentially, and they decide to basically pursue their true loves as opposed to marrying each other, which is what they're supposed to do. And technically, I would say this book is far more character-driven and romance-driven than plot-driven, and the stakes are so low, and the plot is almost non-existent. So if you're looking for like a queer, joyful, low stakes, almost cozy story, I would recommend this book. Although the plot does come into play concerning like the third act and everything, but like basically this book is far more character driven and romance driven than anything else. And I feel like I really have to preface that so that people are not disappointed, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I really enjoy this book because I love reading a character-driven story with a historical fiction setting, because my favorite part of historical fiction are the characters and how the author manages to either successfully or not humanize them amongst what was happening during that time. And I think this book does that so well because I love these characters, I love the romance. I thought everything was so well paced and so well done. So anyway, with that said, I would definitely highly recommend this book. The next book on this list is called Ladies' Night, and I would highly recommend this book for fans who felt disappointed by Gwen and Alt and want something with a little bit more of a plot, because this book is a YA Sapphic historical fiction book following two main characters, one of which is the daughter of a blacksmith, and she is currently disguising herself as a knight to enter a tournament that she can't enter as herself because she's a girl, and the prize of that tournament is the hand of a princess who is the other main character. Does that make sense? This book was so good and so awesome. I loved the characters and the sapphic romance. I love a good solid forbidden romance when it's queer. I don't really enjoy it when it's straight because then the stakes like don't really exist. Like, why can't they date if it's straight? Like, who cares? Anyway, I thought this book was so good and so awesome. I'm not quite sure if they're all sequels necessarily, but if they're all, I will gladly read them. Second of all, some people would categorize this book as a fantasy more than a historical fiction, but technically it's set during a medieval time based on our world. So I categorize it as a historical fantasy, although it's driven more so, I think, by the coincidental plot than anything else. Like, nothing fantastical or magical or supernatural happens in this world necessarily, without any spoilers. But anyway, overall, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so well done. I've articulated this review better in the recent reads video where I talked about this book for the very first time, in case you're interested. But anyway, in conclusion, I thought this book was so good. I loved the banter and the romantic chemistry and the characters and the plot and everything. So anyway, with that said, I would definitely highly recommend it. The last book on this list, and definitely not the least, is called Into the Bright Open. This story is a YA historical fiction retelling of The Secret Garden, which I googled was originally set during the early 1900s. And I didn't know that because I don't think I've ever read The Secret Garden. But I think it's one of those books that has been referenced so many times that I do know the bare bones of the plot, I think. But basically, when I read this book, I really knew next to nothing about the nuances of the plot or the themes or anything like that. So reading a retelling meant for me that fairly everything was very new to me, which I really appreciated, and this book was so good. First of all, I love the setting, I love the plot, I love the characters, I love the romance. I think everything about this book is so well done and so good. I love the majority of these remixed classics that I've been reading lately. I think the next one in this series comes out in January, and I think it's a Killian, if I'm not mistaken. I don't really remember which classic it's going to retell, but anyway, this book was so good and so fantastic and so lovely. So anyway, with that said, I would definitely highly recommend it. So in conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, historical fiction is one of my favorite genres, and I love reading particularly diverse book recommendations, or at least I prefer reading diverse book recommendations. Although obviously just because a book is diverse doesn't necessarily mean that it will be automatically amazing. So anyway, with that said, that's why it's been a year since I've made a book recommendation video like this, because sometimes I read a queer book and it's very mid. So anyway, in conclusion, if you enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to give it a big thumbs up. Comment down below the glasses emoji if you made it all the way to the end of the video. Thanks for watching, subscribe to my channel if you're new, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!